In early 1944, a transport train crosses rural America carrying German POWs. At Aero 942, near a supply corridor in Louisiana, they see something unexpected: mile-long freight lines, uninterrupted factory complexes, and trucks moving in synchronized columns. One prisoner mutters that it does not look like a country at war. It looks like a machine that has already won. The train rattles forward as dust and heat press through the railcar while silence hangs inside. Outside, industry moves without pause. Railcars feeding factories, and factories feeding railcars in an endless cycle of production. Faces press against barred windows, watching a system that feels larger than the war itself. Then the realization lands. They are not passing multiple sites. They are passing a single industrial complex that takes more than 20 minutes to clear. After surrender across multiple European fronts during World War II, thousands of German soldiers were shipped to detention facilities across the United States under Geneva Convention protocols. Many expected temporary holding camps similar to those in Europe. Instead, they encountered an organized detention system integrated into national infrastructure. Transport convoys moved on rail schedules precise to the minute. Guards were few, but logistics were everywhere. The prisoners noticed something else immediately: abundance. Food stocks, fuel reserves, and mechanical equipment appeared uninterrupted by wartime scarcity. Everything suggested a system that was still fully supplied, still fully functioning, and still expanding despite global conflict. The arrival itself became the first structural shock, not from force or intimidation, but from scale, order, and industrial consistency unlike anything many of them had experienced before. The typical German POW was not a caricature of history, but a trained infantryman, engineer, or tank crew member shaped by the realities of European mechanized warfare. Many had fought through conditions defined by scarcity, fuel shortages, broken rail lines, delayed resupply, and fragmented logistics that constantly limited operational reach. From their perspective, every modern industrial nation was under similar strain. That assumption became their blind spot. Inside the camps, they began noticing something unfamiliar. American guards repaired vehicles in hours rather than days. Replacement parts were not scavenged or improvised. They were readily available, categorized, and delivered as part of a system that never seemed to pause. Maintenance was not a desperate act of survival, but a scheduled routine. What they called luxury was actually standardization. And with that first exposure to camp systems, their expectations of how an industrial war should function began to quietly break apart. At camps such as those in Texas and the Midwest, prisoners were assigned structured labor that mirrored a functioning industrial ecosystem, rather than a temporary holding environment. Agriculture, machinery repair, and warehouse logistics were organized into predictable cycles that operated with steady discipline. At 060 Graz during daily roll call, they observed tractors already in motion across fields, each fitted with standardized, replaceable parts systems, an approach many European farms had been unable to maintain under wartime strain. Equipment was not treated as irreplaceable. It was designed to be swapped, repaired, and returned to service without delay. One POW later observed that a single repair shed contained more tools, calibrated instruments, and spare components than an entire battalion maintenance unit in Europe. Alongside it, conveyor-fed supply systems moved food, parts, and materials in uninterrupted loops, creating a rhythm of efficiency that required no improvisation. The shock was not rooted in cruelty or deprivation, it was rooted in efficiency. One shed contained what a battalion once begged for, and beyond the perimeter wire, the scale of that system was only beginning to reveal itself. Selected POW labor. Details were taken near industrial zones under controlled movement and observation. From designated vantage points, They saw something that did not align with their expectations of wartime production. Massive assembly plants operated with a rhythm that felt almost continuous. Aircraft components moved along production lines with a speed and consistency that defied what many of them had known in Europe. What had taken weeks to manufacture under strained conditions elsewhere was being completed in hours, then immediately integrated into a larger distribution network. Rail lines ran directly into factory complexes, eliminating delays between production and transport. Finished goods exited on synchronized schedules, as if the entire system had been engineered around timing itself rather than individual effort. During one shift change, a prisoner counted approximately 40 trucks passing a single point in under a minute. The movement was not chaotic. It was coordinated, repetitive, and unbroken. The realization built slowly but firmly. What they were witnessing was not isolated industrial strength, but a fully integrated system designed for constant output. They weren't seeing factories. They were seeing multiplication. And in that moment, the doctrine they had been trained to believe in began to collide with a reality they could no longer ignore. POWs began comparing American output to the constraints they had lived under throughout the war in Europe. Their training had emphasized tactical superiority, better positioning, sharper coordination, and battlefield efficiency. But what they were now observing belonged to an entirely different category of power: strategic overproduction. Among them, an engineer prisoner attempted rough calculations based on visible throughput, transport frequency, and observed factory scale. His conclusion was unsettling. A single American industrial facility, operating at observed capacity, could replace battlefield losses faster than an entire division could realistically inflict them under European conditions. This created a psychological inversion that many struggled to articulate. For the first time, battlefield skill no longer appeared to be the decisive factor. Instead, endurance was being dictated by production, by how quickly machines, materials, and manpower could be replaced. Victory was no longer about winning battles. It was about sustaining them. And as this understanding settled in, the realization did not remain theoretical. It deepened, quietly and persistently, into acceptance of a new kind of war they had not been trained to comprehend. By late 1945, as World War II drew toward its end, many POWs began documenting their observations in informal notes and conversations. What they described was not simply industrial strength, but a system that functioned like layered automation. Agriculture sustained cities, cities sustained factories, and factories sustained the front without visible interruption. At Fort Tinu, on a typical workday, one camp observer recorded continuous movement across rail, road, and production networks within a 50-mile radius. Trains arrived and departed on schedule. Trucks flowed between distribution points, and assembly lines maintained output without any visible bottlenecks or pauses in coordination. The realization that followed was not emotional at first. It was analytical. They began to understand why supply shortages had rarely crippled American forces in the same way they had undermined their own operations throughout Europe. They finally understood what had been fighting them all along. And in the aftermath of that understanding, their interpretation of the war itself began to quietly change. After repatriation, many former POWs reported difficulty explaining what they had seen. Post-war Europe was rebuilding from scarcity and destruction, while the United States appeared to have emerged from the same conflict with expanded capability rather than exhaustion. Their reflections gradually turned philosophical. Skill could win battles in moments of contact, but systems determined the outcome of prolonged war. What mattered was not only what a soldier could do, but what an entire nation could sustain, replace, and scale under pressure. Two contrasts became especially persistent in their accounts: craftsmanship versus scalability. and individual heroism versus industrial infrastructure. One represented mastery under constraint. The other represented endurance without pause. They left as soldiers. They returned as witnesses. And in that final realization, the war they thought they understood began to look like something entirely different, defined, less by front lines, and more by the systems operating far behind them. The story closes on a simple but unsettling reflection. Perception and reality are often separated by scale. In war, the decisive question is not only what is fought on the battlefield, but what is built behind it, day after day, without pause. What matters more in modern conflict? Individual excellence in the moment, or the industrial systems that sustain everything around it? CTA, comment where you are watching from and share your view. Do you think modern warfare is more about machines or people?